So what we can say and what we can see in the research data is that the more developed countries come in terms of GDP growth is that there are socially typically two things happening. Countries tend to become slightly less hierarchical and more individualistic. Whether individualism or less hierarchy drives growth is another question, because there are plenty of countries which have a very hierarchical culture yet have also good economical growth.
All right, so I want to get into the dimensions because I can see some very interesting concepts here. I'd like you to speak to these dimensions and how individually they work.
So individualism has a lot to do with how many mental connections and responsibilities do we have with a wider family. So are you expected to take care of a wider family or only of basically your direct family, wife, kids, parents maybe, but not beyond?
All right then. So now let's look at first the power distance index. I see it's one of the dimensions we're looking at in India. I'd like you to speak on this one.
So power distance surprisingly doesn't say much about do individuals themselves take or regain power. It has much more to do with does the majority of the population accept that a lot of power is vested in a certain individual. So it is the majority that accepts that a minority or an individual has and retains certain power-related privileges.
All right, then because I'm a student of organizational culture as well, and I kind of understand power dynamics in the office. I understand that based on different power dynamics in the office. I'd like to understand how this plays out at a national level.
So a question really is that if a certain power holder has privileges, there are quite a few societies which are examples of this. And as long as that power holder acts like a benevolent father or mother, meaning uses his or her power to benefit a larger group of people, not just an internal group, people are okay with that power holder retaining the power. And that's why often you see in certain countries that are very hierarchical, that power holders put a lot of communication effort in showcasing that they take care of the population at large. And that allows them also, as a power holder, to retain their own privileges. The moment they would stop providing for a larger group of people, they will lose power rather quickly.
All right, I see that you have a comparison tool here for countries.
Yes.
I would like to know how African countries stack up.
So you could say that by and large, most African countries score slightly more power-oriented, as in hierarchy-oriented. Village elders are a good example of it. Presidents that have a lot of decision-making power, as opposed to parliamentary governments that have power as well, but is much more shared. So that's basically the bigger difference, that in Africa you can still see a relatively large amount of power and therefore responsibilities, of course, also vested in a rather small group of people. And you see that at a local level with the so-called village elders. You'll see this with governments, you'll see this with presidents, you'll see it inside companies. A lot of weight is put on the shoulders of a relatively small group of people.
Okay, interesting, because when I look at this, I'm listening to your dimensions, I'm looking at Africa as a continent, and I understand a country like Nigeria, we have, as much as we're all in one nation, there's quite a lot of diversity in there. And I'd like you to speak to diversity and how a country or an organization can strategize for first with the cultures in there and understanding all the dynamics that come to play.
I would say it would start with visualizing what are these value preferences. If we talk about a country, what are the differences in value preferences that the different regions or tribes have? Because by looking at the differences, you will also see what do they have in common. And if you want to build a nation, then you can't understand what people have in common until you understand where do they differ. And if you want to leverage diversity, really leverage it, you also need to understand what are the things that make us like a country, or what are the things that make us like a company. At the same time, also acknowledging the fact that there will be regional, or there will be, for that matter, business unit differences. So the challenge is always find enough commonalities but leave enough space for diversity and its differences to come out, because that's the beauty of it, is that we do not all need to be the same. As long as there's enough things that connect us, that bind us, then that gives enough space for diversity to really come out beyond just the visible diversity, but really diversity in behavior, in thoughts, in actions.
Okay, but when I think about being strategic about culture, one statement comes to mind. I think about it every time when and it's Peter Drucker talking about the fact that culture will always eat strategy for breakfast. I'd like you to speak to that one.
I would say, the statement itself is good. It makes an impact. At the same time, we'd also like to balance it and put it in perspective. Is that, think about a company, and a company says, we have a great culture. That's fantastic, but what's the purpose of the culture? I mean, as a company, you have a strategic goal, so you need to sell something, you need to deliver some services. So what's the kind of culture that best supports that? So it always has to be a combination of having a good strategy, a supporting culture, rather than good or bad, a supporting culture, and a product or a service that sells.
All right, then, but I'd like to look at your work in Nigeria. How long have you been in Nigeria, and how extensive is your work in Nigeria?
So it's been a pleasure basically now for the last roughly 6 months. We've started with first operations in Nigeria, and now we're actually tomorrow, Wednesday, we're going to officially launch our first Africa office. That's going to be here in Lagos, Hofstede Insights Nigeria. And I'd say the lessons learned so far is that companies have certain recognizable challenges, specifically with regards to finding and retaining talented people. And that is a challenge that you'll find in many other countries for that matter as well. I think the people that we've been lucky to work with have really understood that in order for their companies or institutions to be here in 20 years from now, 50 years from now, they need to build institutions, they need to build working practices that make sense, working practices that unite people, and working practices that give people the opportunity to develop and to have a view that, okay, if I stick with this company, it'll develop me, and that allows me to be here 5 years from now, 10 years from now, gaining in skill, gaining in experience. And I think that's been the lucky position that we've experienced in the last 6 months.
All right.